Joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Newton, Massachusetts, Thomas Barfield, Director of the Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilization at Boston University. In our nation's capital, Shima Khan, columnist with the Globe and Mail and founder of the Canadian Council on American Islamic Relations. With us here in studio, Jawed Taheri, lawyer at the Taheri Law Office, and Imam Shabir Ali, president at the Islamic Information Center. I want to thank all of you for joining us today on rather short notice to participate in this discussion tonight, and I want to start by reading, well, this says it quite starkly, and then we'll start here and go on from there. This is the judge in his remarks to the court, as printed in today's Globe. The apparent reason behind these cold-blooded, shameful murders was that the four completely innocent victims offended your twisted notion of honor, a notion of honor that is founded upon the domination and control of women, a sick notion of honor that has absolutely no place in any civilized society. Let's get it started. Shima Khan, what did you think when you read those words today?
Well, I fully agreed with the judge. There is no place for this kind of premeditated murder in any society. And I think it was important for him, as well as the Crown, to send a very clear message regarding the fact that this won't be tolerated or accepted in any way, shape, or form here in Canada.
Jawed Taheri, what did you think of the language the judge used to condemn this family?
Well, the language that was used as far as the conviction and the actual sentencing, of course it was appropriate, but at the same time we also have to distinguish between murder and honor killing. In this case, of course, it was couched in that terminology that this was an honor so-called killing. It's not a black and white issue from my perspective.
What's not black and white about it?
The black and white part, whether this was actually an honor killing as we know it, or whether it was a premeditated murder that was carried out by a family that was bent on keeping women under their thumb and making sure that they maintain absolute control over the female members of their family. Now, whether that's an honor killing instigated by religion or culture, or is it simply a person, a family, a patriarch who's trying to maintain control and an iron fist over his family. From what I understand, honor killing has cultural and religious connotations. In this case, of course, throughout the trial, if you follow the evidence that is being presented, that was presented throughout the court process, they tried to justify, in a way, of course they were pleading not guilty, but at the same time, the evidence that was coming out, they were trying to justify in some sense and blaming it or attaching their conduct on their culture and on their religion to some extent as well.
Well, that's Thomas Barfield's area of expertise. And Thomas, in asking you to comment on this, obviously living in Boston, I'm not assuming that you followed every little detail of this trial, but certainly on the cultural issue of so-called honor killings. Can you help us add to that in any way?
Well, what we are looking at is a murder. It is against the law in Canada, and actually it would be against the law in any Islamic country as well. It is a murder, but the question is, how is it either provoked or how is it justified? And to some extent, it looks like the defendants reach back, if not to excuse themselves, but at least to, in their minds, explain that this was a violation of culture that they felt necessary to do something. Looking at some of the details of the trial, it's apparent you were also dealing with a dysfunctional family that was perhaps trying to explain its actions to the community in a way that would be slightly more defensible, but just barely, than if it had been a straight domestic violence case.
Imam, how do you, in your own mind, come down on this issue in terms of whether it is more domestic violence or more, quote-unquote, an honor killing?
Well, I would rather not differentiate so much between the two, because every murder is a dishonorable murder, regardless of what people call the actions. At the same time, there is something known as honor killings, and we should recognize it when we see it and speak about it plainly enough so that we can root it out as a major problem. And in that sense, so we can differentiate between the honor killing and the domestic violence, which might be provoked by certain bouts of anger, by certain situations which are common across the cultures. When we speak of honor killing, we're speaking about something that is culturally very specific. And in that case, as much as it relates to the religion of Islam or to the Muslim communities, we should be aware of what people are thinking about this so that we can correct their mistaken ideologies leading to such actions.
But are you content to use that expression for what you know about this case?
I haven't followed up the details of the case to that close of an extent. You know, the news comes daily almost, and it seems repetitious. And I just waited for the verdict. And, you know, reading the full coverage in today's papers, I get the sense that this is what the Crown pressed on, that yes. This was a premeditated murder, obviously, but for the specific motive of justifying it as an honor killing. And it seems that the Crown does have some evidence in that regard. But regardless of that evidence or not, it is a finding of guilt, it is a crime, and it is a dishonorable murder.
Shima Khan, the judge seemed to be suggesting in his remarks, which were very powerful, and I'm trying to remember myself the last time I heard a judge use such stark commentary in his decision. But he seemed to be suggesting if people in this country believe what the Shafias believe, you're not one of us. You're somebody else, but you're not one of us. Am I inferring too much from the decision when I say that?
Well, I'm trying to reach back and remember his comments exactly myself. I mean, if that's the way it's taken, I don't see anything wrong with that. You know, such kind of thinking should be denounced, and should be denounced in the strongest of terms, and it should be repeated so that the message gets through loud and clear that if you entertain such notions, they are completely unacceptable here in Canada.
Period, full stop. Go ahead.
At the same
Jalo.
time, it is noteworthy to mention that when we bring culture and religion into an act that is illegal in all those countries where we assume honor killing is taking place, then we confuse culture and what is acceptable here and what's acceptable there and what's not acceptable here versus what people may accept as norm in a country such as, let's say, Pakistan or Afghanistan or the Middle East areas. Now, in this case, we have a family, of course, they come from Afghanistan, they are Muslims, but do we indicate to the world through this judgment that these people, in a way, they are coming to Canada with these notions, importing this type of ideology and ways of thinking, which in their country is a norm or maybe a norm and has no place in this country. That's not the case. That's the point that I disagree with. Things like this, the culture that I came from Afghanistan back in the 80s. The culture, the Afghan culture that I am aware of, that I grew up in, does not condone this kind of behavior. In fact, until I came to Canada, I wasn't even familiar with the term honor killing until very recently.
I'd like to get the Imam to follow up on that, but just before you do, I do want to remind everybody that we do want to hear your comments on this issue tonight, and if you go to our website right now, theagenda.tvo.org, our two producers from tonight's program, Daniel Kitts and Alison Buchan-Terrell, are hosting a live chat on our homepage right now, so please visit us, theagenda.tvo.org, and weigh in with your comments. Imam, every time something like this happens, it does give ammunition to those who believe that Islam condones these acts. We're going to talk about culture, but we're also going to talk about religion tonight. What does Islam say about all of what we've been hearing about over the past few months?
Well, in the first place, Islam does not allow for ordinary individuals to take the law into their own hands. If there is a crime committed, then the crime has to be brought before a judge, and a trial has to be fair and open, and then a ruling will be issued by the judge. If there is a penalty to be carried out, it will be state enacted.
Does Islam say anything about honor killing, so-called?
Not that I know of. There's nothing that in the Quran or in the prophetic statements that will justify this, what people are referring to as honor killings. In fact, we know that in the history of the prophets, there have been prophets who have had disobedient children. The prophet Adam. Adam is known from the Bible, also from the Quran, and in Islam he is considered to be a prophet. And they are the models of society. And yet, of Adam's first two sons, Cain killed Abel. So one was a murderer. But it wasn't for Adam to take matters into his own hands. The story of Noah and the flood is told in the Quran. Noah's son was disobedient, and instead of boarding the ark, he said, I'll take myself to a high mountain and be saved from whatever comes. But of course, he wasn't saved. But he was visited with the wrath of God, not Noah's predetermined act punishing his son. And we can go on and on. The Prophet Muhammad himself faced a situation where one of his wives was accused of adultery. And when he made some investigations and people came forward and brought their evidence, he eventually said to her, okay, just go back to your parents' home until we sort this matter out, because it became a massive scandal in the community. So he didn't harm her in the least. There was just a period of cooling off until the matter could be laid to rest. And eventually the matter was laid to rest in her favor. She was declared to be innocent. So we have examples in the tradition that show that it is not for any person to take the matter into his own hands to be judge, jury, and executioner.
Okay. Let me follow up with Thomas Barfield then. Where you've studied, obviously, Muslim civilization. I wonder if you could help us understand where it is that this notion of honor killings in some parts of the Islamic world are acceptable.
Well, I would say it is very important to separate out the culture from the religion, because sometimes people say it's part of our religion, particularly in rural areas, but they're not actually very well educated in their religion. And in fact, it goes against the tenets of their religion. But I should point out that actually honor killing is part of a broader theme that also includes things like blood feuds, where people will take revenge killings.
So that goes well
these are
beyond
also
the Muslim
illegal.
world then.
What I'm about to say is that yes, not only does it go beyond the Muslim world, so do honor killings. There's essentially a belt of cultures running from the Mediterranean through the Middle East all the way to the borders of India, where the whole conception of honor and blood feud one finds in these cultures. And these are both Christian and Muslim. And one is, I would say, as likely to find a scandal over an honor killing in Sicily or Greece or Christian parts of Lebanon as you would in the Islamic world. So in other words, we're dealing with a cultural phenomena that has an overlay of religion, but in fact has more in common Sicily to Greece to Afghanistan to the northwest frontier of Pakistan in terms of cultural attitudes towards the role of women, towards the honor of families, than it does with any specific religion. Our focus on Islam, to some extent, we put the two together because of where immigrants come from. But in earlier generations, you might have found a similar scandal taking place, immigrants from southern Italy or from mountainous parts of Greece.
Let me introduce a new voice who will join our discussion now in our studios in London, Ontario. Saliha Khan. She's a board member at the Muslim Resource Center and a spokesperson with the Family Honor Project. And I want to pick up on one thing, Saliha. Thanks for joining us, incidentally. I want to pick up on one thing that we were talking about just a moment ago before you arrived. And that was the very strong comments of the judge, who seemed to be suggesting in his summation that if you believe in the values of this family, you're not like us. You're not one of us in Canada. And I wonder if I could get you to comment on that and tell me whether you agree with that summation.
Again, I guess well, thank you for having me, and my apologies for being late. London's getting hit with snow and roads weren't exactly safe.
We're glad you're with us.
Thank you. In terms of, I think what really stuck with me in terms of when the justice spoke was the whole idea about the twisted notion of honor. I think that what really spoke to me in terms of how people would define honor for themselves. And I was listening to the speaker earlier, and I absolutely agree. It has nothing to do with any particular faith group or any causation or justification with any of those faiths that he mentioned. It has more to do with cultural or historical elements that would have existed in those particular communities. And in terms of, when we talk about Canadian values, you're looking at universal values of justice, and any murder of innocent individual, we naturally say that it was a completely unjust act.
Jawed, I wonder if you could tell us how concerned you are that with the extensive media coverage this case has received and the consistent and frequent use of the term honor killing in describing this, that somehow the entire Muslim community is going to be tarred with the same brush. You concerned about that?
Yes and no. On the one hand, I am quite optimistic about the fact that Canadian society in general is quite open-minded, and they understand the roots of these problems, and we've had enough discussions in this country to enlighten, so to speak, the population about what is an act of aggression on a personal level and what is exactly cultural or religious. In this case, of course, any negative stereotyping of a population should be condemned, and it should be stopped. And it's our job as educators and also as part of the media to ensure that the society in general is aware of the differences and we don't portray them all in one brush. But
I don't doubt that for a second.
Yes.
But my hunch is when people heard the verdict, one of the first things they said to themselves was, we're a tolerant society, but that doesn't belong in Canada, and if you think that way, get on a boat and go somewhere else.
Absolutely, and anyone who thinks that way or acts in that manner shouldn't be condoned in any way. And just like we have people like Marc Lépine or we have someone like Picton, they belong to the prison system. Or for that matter, Bernardo is still behind bars. Simply by virtue of the fact that someone is an immigrant, and simply by saying that, well, this immigrant committed a crime, therefore kick them out of the country, we have to understand that there are individuals, immigrants who do commit crimes, and there are immigrants who look at that and they're completely in disagreement with what they think and how they think.
Yeah. I want to get Shima to follow up on that because, you've put your finger on something interesting, which is that in the Bernardo case or the Picton case, they certainly don't say, aha, we have, there go, white Anglo-Saxon males once again. But some people will look at this case and they will say, there go the Muslims again. What do you do about that, Shima?
Well, those who want to hold on to their prejudices, you can try and educate them and dialogue with them, but, people are free to think what they want, and some are just adamant about holding on to preconceived notions. I'm more interested in the conversations with the wider Canadian public who want to move forward from this horrible tragedy, want to honor the lives of these 4 women and other women who've come before them, and want to do something so that such an incident never happens again. What can we take from this, learn from it, and put steps into place so that it never happens again? And I think that's what we should do. And if we're going to just go into our silos and point fingers and be judgmental, that's just not going to happen. And that, I think, would be a terrible loss.
No, I hear you, but Imam, I wonder, you as a man of faith, as a man of religion, I wonder how you feel when you hear of a family in the name of religion saying, I had to kill my children because of it was all about my family's honor and my religion permits me to do that.
Naturally, a case like this impacts on the entire Muslim community immediately from the time it has gone to trial. It has impacted on the Muslim community. People are wondering, how could anyone do something like this in the name of our religion? And many Muslims feel shy about something like this happening. So the answer to it is to name it for what it is and to try and root it out from our society. All societies, of course, have and all communities have delinquent elements. Javed had just mentioned a few elements from our Canadian society. Such a delinquency or deviant behavior, it may come out in one way or another. There's a certain type of criminal mind or a criminal behavior. that either manifests itself in this direction or that direction. From among Muslims, we are noticing that sometimes women become victims of this that is called honor killing. My only hesitation in using the term is lest someone might get the idea that there's something honorable about this kind of killing. It's just that everyone else doesn't accept this. But we should make it clear that this is totally dishonorable. It is contrary to our religious principles. One person may have committed some wrong, but you, by killing that person, you're committing a greater crime than the other person has committed.
I want Thomas Barfield to follow up on that, because you've heard us invoke the name of a couple of the worst mass murderers, or if not mass murderers, heinous murderers in Canadian history already on this program. But none of them said they did it for reasons of maintaining honor. And I want you to help us understand this notion, quote unquote, of honor in some cultures. Start with Afghanistan, if you like. How does the notion of honor play in Afghan society?
Well, honor, particularly in rural areas, and this is more of a rural phenomenon than an urban one, but the prestige of a family depends upon the actions of its members. And one of the reasons they're concerned with this is the action of any member of the group reflects positively or negatively on the whole family, and in some cases, the whole extended family or even a village. Therefore, it's not just seen as a personal concern, it's seen as a concern for an entire community. And there's therefore particular ways one acts to preserve honor, to gain honor, and the community and families attempt to avoid doing anything that might impugn their honor, because this would then, it would reduce the marriage potential of their daughters if the family has a bad reputation. It could impugn the entire community. But in most cases, what it does is actually uphold a code of values where in the background there's this threat. If you ever violate this, then something bad could happen. But to some extent, a code works precisely because people think they should not break the rules. For this reason, there's one standard which people are expected to maintain. Now, the fact is, in rural areas, this is a relatively easy standard to maintain. Lack of temptation, everybody knows everybody else. The difficulty often comes up in situations where you move to a different country where there are different values. And very often, as has been mentioned, this is not religion. Any rural family coming to the city usually finds the city morals too loose.
Thomas, I'm going to jump in for a second here. We're having a devil of a time hearing you on your, something's wrong with your microphone at the moment, so we'll get that fixed, then come back to you a little bit later. Sorry about that. Saliha Khan, let me get you in here, because if this notion of honor, as it has been described, does not come from the Quran, and we've already heard from the Imam that it does not, you know, you've studied this, you're working on this project right now in London. Where does this notion of honor come from?
As the experts have talked about it, I mean, you're certainly looking at cultural and historical, and definitely historical context to the notion of honor that's being talked about. What we are trying to do in terms of our project with the Family Honor Project is exactly define what honor means for the family, define what honor is, how honor is seen, and how it will be preserved by, with the help of working with the service providers. And it's really looking at creating a different paradigm, a completely different discourse around what true honor is. There is no honor in violence. There is nothing honorable about violence whatsoever. And this is the key message that we really hope to really bring about and talk about. The gentleman ahead before me talked about the code. Let's kind of reprogram the code if that's the code that some people are still working with. Here in particular within and I can only speak from the experience of London area. We've dealt with the community, we've dealt with service providers, we've done a lot of relationship building at both levels, and we understand that there is an issue in terms of trust. How can families come forward and speak to or speak with service providers, how can they talk to the teachers? How can they talk to the social workers at schools? How can they talk to nurses? How can they talk to doctors? How can they talk to people who, who can help them with mental health concerns and mental health issues? There are just so many elements, so many gaps that exist in terms of where people can fall through these. They're not even cracks. They're these huge chasms where people can really fall through. So what we're really trying to do is create that kind of safety net for families, again, in full support and collaboration with service providers. Because if we're really going to start speaking about honorable behavior and honorable alternatives in terms of dealing with issues of conflict, whether it's intergenerational or within spouses or dealing within family issues, then we really need to redefine what that word is for us.
Well, as we further explore this, let me go to Shima Khan with this, because maybe all of the examples that I think we know of off the top of our heads here, when it comes to maintaining family honor, involve a man harming a woman to maintain family honor. Do you know of any examples that go the other way?
You mean a woman harming a man?
Exactly, in the name of the family honor.
Off the top of my head, no, but I just want to correct something. It's unfortunately, it's not just the man, but it's the family. It's a man, his wife, sometimes a son. And we've had examples of this where I think, and this is why I think it's essential to distinguish it from domestic violence, from the way we understand domestic violence. Domestic violence usually involves one person, usually a male partner, harming a female. Whereas in this case, it's a crime perpetrated by a group of people, and unfortunately, women are part of this. They have also accepted this notion of honor. So I think this is something we have to think about. I do know of a case where just I think last year, 2 years ago, a mother in Montreal of Rani origin tried to stop her daughter who came home after curfew. Again, concerned about a daughter violating the family rules. And this wasn't a case of a man harming a woman, it was a case of a woman harming a woman. So I think there's a lot of complexity here.
So the notion, David, of this being an overwhelmingly male against female thing, we may have to revisit that?
We may have to revisit. In fact, the professor may enlighten us on this subject, but I have read and I've heard of cases where it's the victim is actually a male member of the family, bringing allegation of dishonoring the family. So it's not necessarily a female victim always, but as Shima indicated rightfully, yes, the family in the cases where honor killing is carried out, from my own reading of the subject, the family do take part as a whole. But I want to point out, to bring something else into the picture, the fact that whether the social services or the support system in this case failed these girls. Mm-hmm. They did try to reach out. They did try to reach out to the community. They did try to reach out to their teachers, to their educators, to even to the police in some instances.
What was the response?
The response was obviously not positive. In this case, somehow they fell through the cracks. Now, the other issue that we need to also bring into the fold is whether these girls felt they were going through an identity crisis, obviously. What kind of, I guess, resources were available to assist them integrate into this society as teenagers that could assist them work out something outside the school, outside the home, but at the same time be acceptable in the, I guess, the familial or the cultural norms that they come from. Mm-hmm. In this case, obviously, the transition was such a drastic transition that the family felt that they had to do something, and they had to do something so drastic as to wipe out half of the family, so to speak. And where were the resources that we talk about, and why weren't they believed, and why weren't they taken seriously in this case?
So if I hear you right, it sounds like you're saying there is more than just I don't mean this to sound as dramatic as it will, but there's more than just this family with blood on its hands here.
From my perspective, yes. I would argue that had steps been taken in here, appropriate measures been taken, those girls might be
alive. They might still be alive.
Steve, I have something to add here.
Please.
Unless Thomas's mic is back up, I'll just pick up on something that he was elucidating. It's the whole community that actually gets involved, and what we see here as the honor killing is the pinnacle of the entire community sentiment. The family needs to justify itself to the community, and the community has certain norms and standards that somehow gets violated by some of the members. And then it becomes the responsibility of the immediate family to fix themselves, to fix house. And this goes back to Old Testament times. I mean, we have it in the Old Testament that if the daughter of a priest commits fornication, she should be burnt because she has dishonored her father, the priest. In another case, it is mentioned that if a girl is proved to be not a virgin on her wedding night, then the girl should be brought to the father's door and there be stoned to death. And it's the entire community that takes part in this.
Just curious, are the punishments for boys doing the same thing as strict as they are for girls?
Well, no, it hasn't been. And of course, we're speaking here of the Old Testament record. This is how people have seen things around the Mediterranean basin, and the Old Testament is a record of how people thought in those times. So the entire community participates in this because, as the Scripture says, you are to purge the evil from Israel. So you're to clean not only the house but the entire community, and the house that violates this purity of the community is somehow dishonorable, and it has to restore its honor. So to get over this, Muslims, I believe, have to look carefully at the Quran to see how it is different from the previous scriptures, what specifically the Quran says, and why the Quran does not condone that type of violence. The Quran does not speak of this kind of honor killing. The Quran speaks about individual responsibility. In a singular family, you can have many diverse persons, each picking its own path. And the Quran says, لِكُلٍّ وِجْهَةٌ هُوَ مُوَلِّيهَا. Everyone has a sort of direction that he chooses for himself. And everyone will, on the day of judgment, bear his or her own burden. لَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. No soul shall bear the burden of another. So everyone is individually responsible for his or her actions. Yes, parents do try to cajole and persuade their children to do what they believe is right, but there comes a certain age when you can only let them go on their own, let them make their own mistakes, learn from their own mistakes, and be there as supporting friends to help them pick themselves up after their mistakes.
Thomas Barfield, I think we've got your microphone back now. Anything you want to pick up on there and add to that you've heard so far?
Well, I think the interesting point about social services, one of the reasons to understand the whole concept of honor killings is precisely because a social service agency may be aware that women of a particular culture, young women, might be in a particular danger because of these beliefs that in another culture might just be considered adolescent rebellion. I think that's the reason, not that it's justified. My guess would be that had such a murder occurred in Afghanistan even, this would not be considered honorable at all, particularly because the murder of the wife along with the daughters certainly doesn't fall even within the normal expectations of an honor code. That does look like a dysfunctional family. And in general, in addition, in terms of honor codes, very often, particularly in terms of an elopement, that is a violation of honor. The daughter shouldn't have done it, but very often the families reconcile by accepting the marriage. So there are many different paths even to restoring honor, and to some extent when a family's difficulties come to public life, the murder is actually seen as a failure of the family. Even if they are saying we expunged our honor, the gossip underneath is that actually they didn't. They let things get out of hand. As was also mentioned, this is not purely male on female behavior, because women's opinions are some of the important guardians of this kind of system. They can ruin a man's reputation through gossip by impugning his honor. They also know what happens much more with the women of the community than the men in a gender-segregated society. So very often the question of how women consider what's going on is a particularly important aspect.
Just before I quote one of the women who actually is on our program today, she had something in the Globe and Mail this morning. Let me just remind everybody that you, our viewers, if you want to weigh in on this subject, please visit our website. It's theagenda.tvo.org. The two people who produce this program, Alison Buck-and-Terrell and Daniel Kitts, are standing by there to moderate an online chat, so if you want to weigh in with your thoughts, please do it there. Now, from this morning's Globe and Mail, Tubia Yaya denied ever hearing the term, quote, honor killing, yet her older sister, Soraya, approved killing for the sake of honor, telling La Presse's Michel Ouimet in Kabul that if someone committed a shameful act, they deserve to be eliminated. Her son agreed, adding Afghans are right to kill in the name of honor. Her husband added that if his daughters dared to ruin his honor, he would, quote, put them in a sack and eliminate them so that no one could find a trace of them. Clearly, there are some who are unapologetic, standing firmly behind such a heinous practice. That was Shima Khan in the Globe this morning, and I want to follow up just by asking Jawed here, obviously, not every Afghan Canadian supports what the Shafias did. But are there enough that do support it or would support it for it to be considered a problem that the Afghan Canadian community needs to deal with?
Any such even traces of such a practice should be brought to light, of course. And we have to take measures. We have to ensure that our children and the children that are raised in this country or anywhere in the world are protected. But at the same time, whether this is a prevalent practice in Afghanistan, I still disagree. I have done research on this prior to coming to the show, actually, and during the course of this trial as well. Out of curiosity, I did some research on this to see how prevalent this is in Afghanistan for you. It's not. But at the same time, we also have to be mindful of this, the fact that Afghanistan is a country where for the past 33 years or so at least, people have seen nothing but war and violence. The time that I left that country, it was when the Soviet Union had invaded the country and it was under the Soviet occupation. There was war, had just started, but things have gone from bad to worse, as we all know. While the Shafia family left Afghanistan sometime in 1992, which would have been around the time that the Mujahideen took over, but still they had seen enough violence and aggression to I guess, mold them in certain way to be a more accepting of this kind of aggressive behavior.
Just making sure I understand, you are making a direct connection between the violence that Afghanistan has seen and this family's behavior?
Absolutely. You cannot divorce people from their environment.
Shima Khan, what do you say to that?
I'm shaking my head. This concept of honor killing predates the Soviet invasion. And it's been around for centuries. It does exist in pockets of Afghanistan, Pakistan. The UN reports, and it's an underestimate, of about 5,000 honor killings per year throughout the world. And I think, instead of, trying to find explanations, we should do that, but let's focus on the ugly reality in order to address it and diminish it. And I too, I didn't hear about honor killing until about 10 years ago, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. We can't take our own personal reality or our own personal awareness as a measure of the reality that's out there. And I think the more awareness there is of this horrific practice, the better, because it does, raising awareness is just the first step, and then action follows thereafter. So to somehow explain the Shafia's behavior because of the Russian invasion and the civil war that followed, they left. They spent time in Australia, in Pakistan, and then Australia, and then Dubai. Hardly places of violence. So I don't know. I wouldn't just pin it on their years of living through civil strife.
I think Jawed wants to come back on that once more.
We're not denying that honor killing doesn't exist in Afghanistan, as just the same way that it exists in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, and it does exist in Afghanistan. What we're trying to say here is that while this family, being a dysfunctional family, that essentially boils down to violence against women on the part of this family, ensuring that they maintain an iron grip hold on their female members of the family, does not necessarily equate to honor killing, and does not necessarily paint the entire culture in Afghanistan as practicing this as their norm. We have to distinguish, yes, there are devious behaviors and devious people around the world, no matter where you look at it. But at the same time, this particular family, of course, we cannot at the same time ignore the fact that this particular family comes from a war zone, a country that has seen violence over and over and over again. Okay. Millions of people have been killed. And so when we have a war in any country, women are necessarily marginalized. That's a byproduct. Women are often the first casualties of war, any war. And in this case, not only did we see war, but we also saw years later that a regime for 5 to 6 years that strictly targeted women as their number one enemy. We're talking about the Taliban, for example, that basically pushed women indoors and were not even allowed to venture outside of their own homes. And so with that kind of environment, you have to take that into consideration.
Okay, let me get Saliha to address this. You know, the Shafias were not an ordinary Afghan family, if I can put it that way. He's a millionaire. The family is well-traveled. The women did not wear the hijab. Outwardly, they did not seem to be a very religious family. So I wonder, just following up on all the comments we've heard so far, how strongly can we really tie the influence of their religion and their culture on what they did? Admittedly, this will require some speculation on your part, Saliha, but, you know, give us your sense of it.
There was an interesting quote, and I believe it was in Globe and Mail as well. As I was reading through, they were talking about the staff sergeant from Quebec who was speaking with one of the girls, and her whole approach when the girl was, and I believe it was Sahar who was being interviewed at that time, and as the staff sergeant is talking to her, she's also assessing her appearance. So she's looking at her, she's looking at her clothes, she's looking at her jewelry, looking at her, you know, get up, how she looks. And she actually makes the comment about, you know, you're well dressed, you're well, you know, your makeup, you're wearing nice makeup, you're wearing nice clothes, you're wearing nice jewelry. You know, for them it was for observers it was a little bit of a challenge to see them and say, okay, well, where do you fit? You know, they certainly didn't fit in the whole stereotypical. You know, the burqa wearing, and by the burqa I do mean the Afghan style of burqa, you know, which is the blue thing, you know, with top to bottom covered. Mm-hmm. They're not like that. They are certainly feisty from all accounts. They are, you know, they want to have fun. They want to have. They want to engage with people around them. They seem to be quite connected. You have the case of the 13-year-old who's being sent from school because she's wearing, you know, a shirt that was deemed inappropriate by the school policy. So we're, you know, we don't want to sit back and kind of dissect the innocence that was lost. But it, you know, if we start trying to find, well, where's the justification and how does religion allow that? In all honesty, from and again, this is in terms of what my personal take is, as I read through whatever transcripts were made available, religion didn't even come forward in that particular discourse. There was nothing around religion that was brought in to say, well, you know, this person is going against my religion.
Okay, let me pursue the...
Sorry, they talk about Shafia saying he doesn't want his children to fast because that will, quote unquote, stunt their growth. So that is hardly a religious kind of thing. And even Christy Blatchford, you know, when she talked in National Post, she talks about, you know, hardly something that would be seen as a traditional conservative by any means Muslim family. If any, you know, they would probably be deemed by most as being rather progressive and very moderate in terms of their approach towards the religion and how they wish to bring it about it within their lives. But when, you know, so for me, when you start bringing in, or anybody brings in religion, it really kind of makes me wonder where this is coming from. Are we
fair enough. Let me follow up with Thomas Barfield on the violence angle. I mean, it has been pointed out here that Afghanistan, I mean, the Soviets were there in '79. This is a country that has seen bombs falling a lot over the intervening 30-plus years. How do you think all of that affects the notion of honor and whether violence on that country had a role in any of this?
Well, it's very hard to say, particularly for an individual family, but when a country is invaded, actually, Afghans often referred to that as a violation of the country's honor. And, you know, pushing that to the national scale, that we were unable to protect ourselves, our communities against this invader. That's a way of putting international Cold War politics into an honor context. And, you know, some Afghans did see it that way. I don't see the violence per se causing this. I see it as much more common, you see it in Western Europe as well as North America, of immigrant parents who hold one set of values and the next generation adopts Canadian, German, British values that are out of line with what the patriarch thinks is important, and perhaps more importantly, those individual values, the freedom of the individual to choose what she wants to do, is protected by Western laws, whereas if those girls were in Afghanistan, the whole community would be supporting his values, that if they started to stray, the whole community would be gossiping, pushing them, or even telling the father, why haven't you married these girls off? Because in Afghanistan, it's arranged marriages. And so the family, to prevent this from happening, is believed perhaps you should arrange a marriage early so this will not happen. This is not common or permitted in Canada. So what we see, I think, much more than this is a conflict of values in which a patriarch who might have been able to enforce his will with the support of the community in Canada on the behavior of his daughters finds himself unable to do this in North America, and his response is one of domestic violence, one that I would say hardly fits the pattern of honor killings in Afghanistan. This is not how things are resolved in Afghanistan, at least from my experience there.
Shabir Ali, you've had this question before. You're going to get it again every time something like this happens, which thankfully is not too often, but it doesn't happen too often, but it still happens too much. Do Muslim community leaders still have to do more to speak to the issues that we're talking about today?
Yes, I believe so. Earlier, Javed spoke about the cultural discontinuity and the cultural shock that children experience as they are growing up in this country, having parents who are immigrants from another part of the world. It also so happens that the Muslim imams often preach a message which really belongs in another country. They're not quite aware of the cultural challenges that youth are faced growing up in this part of the world. And not only the youth, but the parents in their attempts to keep their youth in the faith and doing everything right. The Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, is reported to have said that if his companions were to neglect 10% of what he was teaching them, then they would be penalized for that. But if later on, a time will come such that if people were to do just 10%, they would be rewarded for that. So he spoke to two different situations, and often we're not aware of the change that has gone on in between. I don't know what percentage it is now, but from the 90% that was required then to the 10% that will be required eventually, we may be somewhere in between. But the messages that are often delivered from the pulpits are such that you would think it's 100% that must be maintained. And that becomes a bar that is too high for anyone to jump, and people go away from the sermons feeling confused. And often people are then trying to fix themselves, to fix their families, fix their youth, fix their daughters, and this can sometimes lead to violence. So Muslim imams have to be very sensitive to the new situation in which we live, relax a little bit, and show Muslims the way in which they can be faithful to the scriptures while swimming with the sharks.
And Jawad, I don't want to leave the impression that this is only something that Muslim imams have to deal with. I wonder whether you think, you're a lawyer, do the Canadian law enforcement officials, do Canadian governments, does the Canadian justice system do enough to make sure that these incidents are blessedly rare?
What we do require, of course, in the criminal justice system, some vigilance is, of course, warranted, but more education in terms of training, culturally sensitivity issues, and to make sure that people understand where to draw the line. When there's situation such as in the case of the Shafia girls, that they should act. And at the same time, we also don't want to leave a situation where they're hyper-vigilant and they're basically targeting communities on the basis of this alleged honor killing or alleged plans to harm the children. A balance has to be stricken, and it has a.
How close are we to the balance right now?
We are there 50% probably, but a lot more work is needed, both from the pulpit, as my friend indicated, but as well from educators and also from the community leaders as well.
About 4 minutes to go. Saliha, can I get you to weigh in on that as to where the accent needs to be put?
Well, I mean, definitely in terms of the pendulum, we know that it unfortunately tends to swing either way, and I think Mr. Jawed is being very generous when he says that we're somewhere at the 50% mark. We actually have a lot of work to do. A couple of issues that really come to my mind right off the bat. You're talking about identifying risk factors, possible indicators around the kind of gender-based violence we are certainly referring to. The notion of honor, or the twisted notion of honor that the judge referred to, it just adds on an added complexity, an added layer of issues that really need to be resolved. But the essence we're talking about is power and control, where one person in the family feels that they are completely incapable of controlling the family members around them, and then they basically really look at weaving that kind of web around other family members to basically ascertain that power that they're talking about. One of the interesting issues or elements that really stuck out for me as I was doing my research as well is the fact that these fathers, and I'm referring to the last 3 cases since 2006, you're talking about fathers who had a record of being abusive, but also who also have the documentation of being completely absentee figures in the lives of their daughters and the lives of their family members. So there is really no relationship. I mean, you cannot all of a sudden decide to be a parent when your child hits 15. You're talking about really being a parent from the get-go. And Imam Shabir Ali over here, he talks about reaching out to the community and having those sermons. Well, maybe those sermons should include having the conversation with your children from a very much young, tender age, where you actually ask them, how did your day go? What happened with you? And a lot of times, does it happen now?
Yeah, that doesn't happen now. Is that what you're saying?
About parents speaking with their children. I mean, you're talking about most of us living in this, high functioning kind of, race society where we try to make ends meet. The recession is yawning at us. We're talking about losing our pensions as well.
I'm going to jump in because we're down to our last 2 minutes, and I want to hear from Shima on this, because Shima, I know from having had you on this program numerous times that yours has been a significant and clear voice on the issue of all of the things we've been talking about today, and the unacceptability of leaders in the Muslim community propagating these stereotypes. But I have to ask the question again, are there enough voices like yours out there in the Muslim community of this country urging people that this is wrong?
I think there are, and I think there's a growing chorus. One of the things that I don't want to generalize, but we've been raised to have a deferential attitude towards authority and our institutions of authority. And I think one of the things we have to learn is that we don't have to wait for the blessings of a mosque or an organization to tell us, yes, go ahead and start your project, go ahead and start your activism. I think we have to take it upon ourselves that if we're disappointed with our leadership, with our institutions, instead of cursing the darkness, light a candle and just do something yourself. Find people with whom you think alike, find partners, and just get on with it and try to change things with your own hands. Don't wait for others to do it for you.
If I can extend the metaphor, I want to thank all 5 of you for lighting a candle on this program tonight. We've really been very appreciative that you could spare so much time for us and have this important conversation. Thank you all very much. To Thomas Barfield at Boston University in Newton, Massachusetts, Shima Khan in Ottawa, Saliha Khan, no relation incidentally, at the Muslim Resource Center in London, Shabir Ali from the Islamic Information Center, Jawed Taheri, the Afghan-Canadian lawyer here in Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.